Speakers, Mr. Andy Sumner from King's College and Susan Olivia from Monash University. And
okay, so this work is part of an ongoing project with my colleague Lucas Schwabel, that's thinking about some of the debates about the emergence of a global middle class and the political and social consequences of that, and to try and look at the case study of Indonesia to see if such a group of people exists as a first stage identification process before thinking about the social and political implications. So the presentation itself is, I'll explain why we call it the scooter class in a moment. The presentation itself has 6 sections. I'll talk a bit about an asset-based approach to identification of new classes or new groups, give a brief review of the global literature on this new middle, and say a bit about an alternative way of thinking about new middle using the case study of Indonesia, and then some potential political and social implications of this new middle. So by means of an introduction, why the scooter class? The work we've been doing, we rather felt that the over-emphasis on new groups around expenditure income was a bit too limited. So we started looking at assets. And one of the substantial rises in assets, particularly over the last 15, 20 years, has been around scooters, but not only. And so we'll say a bit about why we came up with the idea of a scooter class. And then to sort of try and identify how this speaks to the global literature on the new middle classes, and whether they are middle classes in a kind of in a global sense, or whether actually that might be a misleading conceptual label. So a bit of background first of all. There's of course, I mean, there's a lot of interest in this kind of in-between population, which seems to have really expanded over the last 20 years in many middle-income countries like Indonesia. Globally, there's about 2 billion people under $2 a day. But then there's another 1.3 billion between $2 and $4, and then another billion between $4 and $10 a day. And so much of the literature has used these daily expenditure cut-offs to talk about a burgeoning group, a substantial increase in people leading different kinds of lifestyle, certainly in consumption terms. And so the questions arising in much of the global literature, at least, relate to in what sense these groups, drastically increasing as they are, middle class and middle classes, how are they different from other aspects, parts of the distribution, what are their size, composition characteristics, and then leading on to the political and social implications of this new middle. Underlying all of this is a question about whether the substantial rise in the number of people who no longer live in day-to-day poverty, whether these are disparate individuals with little in the way of shared interests or lifestyles, versus whether they actually have a shared identity of some kind, and whether their political and social interests are likely to be different or not from other groups, and whether that would lead to some kind of renegotiation of social contracts. You know, for example, if much of the new middle is barely out of poverty itself, then it may be that the demands for social protection and social insurance policies become much stronger. So the kind of things that may be in demand are, in some ways, some of the things that Indonesia has already introduced. For example, the health insurance program, or expanded the health insurance program. So, what do we mean by an asset-based approach to thinking about these groups? I'll say a bit about the rationale and how this relates to Indonesia. So, I mean, first of all, we have a graph of the benefits of global growth. So this is changes in consumption per person over the last 20 years with and without China. So the vertical axis is the change in consumption, and then the fractal locations, you've got the poorest people here and the richest people here, at least as far as surveys capture or the distribution. The blue curve is kind of famous because this is the Branko-Milanovic curve about the emergence of a new middle and the benefits of globalization going to this group here. What we actually find is when you remove China, actually this group is perhaps not doing quite as well as this might first appear, and maybe many of the gains in a relative term may have been at the bottom. But that's a global picture, and of course when you aggregate hundreds of countries into one picture, you inevitably lose some of the detail. So that all raises a question about whether a global middle class has emerged at all. If you look at the kind of population and look at the shift of the curve, black is 1990, then red is 2010. What you've undeniably seen is a shift of the population density in terms of income per capita. Right, so people are getting better off. But the increase in population is really in those in the $2 to $10 range rather than those in the higher ranges. And actually the consumption growth in those groups is relatively limited compared to the consumption growth higher on the distribution. So that's sort of a kind of global overview. I mean, at this stage, you could well ask, why does this... sorry, I'm going to put that down. I'm just going to talk loudly. Is that recording?
We can hear you.
You can hear me, right? Yeah.
Okay.
I don't need to boom. One of the things about when you're holding one of these microphones is that what you can hear in the back of your sort of reverberating in your ears is your own voice, which is very disturbing. So why does this even matter? Why would you care about the emergence of a new group of the population who are poor on a day-to-day basis, but probably don't have the kind of security that you'd associate with traditional understandings of concepts of middle class or secure classes? There's three reasons. First is three reasons at least that we hypothesize for further exploration. The first is as people get better off, they change their relationship with the state. In the sense that poor people pay relatively little tax and arguably thus have a different kind of relationship with the state because they're not financing it. As people move into the non-poor group, their consumption patterns change, they pay indirect taxes, they start to actually financially contribute to the state. And so one way that this could be significant is their perceptions of what the state does or doesn't do can sometimes be open to more challenge. I mean, if you look at places like Brazil, Turkey, maybe India, the burgeoning group of non-poor people have been associated with some of the protests against corruption in India, against corruption in Brazil. And so people's perceptions of the state are shifting as they move into this group, potentially. So there's a hypothesis to explore. Secondly, the funding of the state itself is shifting. In Indonesia it shifted some time ago, but it's certainly in favour of domestic sources, domestic taxation. If you can fund the state through three means, resource rents, taxation, or donor money, aid money, arguably the responsiveness or accountability of the state relates to its financing. If the state is financed by resource rents, then the state is more likely to be responsive to those. If the state is financed by donors, the state may be more responsive. And this speaks to much of the literature by people like Mick Moore and others who've worked on taxation for a number of years. And then also one could argue that a larger group of people in the kind of middle may have frustrated aspirations. They may be looking for greater security, may have a notable desire for social insurance, for example health insurance, and freedom from vulnerability to poverty. So the kind of policy demands may shift as this group emerges. So what about Indonesia? I mean, first of all, taking Indonesia's growth pattern. So this is the growth incidence curve for Indonesia, the percentage change in consumption per capita, and then the fractile locations, and the poorest here and the richest here as far as survey the Sumner captures this. And then we've laid the international poverty lines across as well as $10 and $50. And so you can see, it doesn't make a lot of difference what period you look at. The growth in Indonesia is kind of broad-based at the bottom in the sense that there's substantial increases in the consumption of the poorer, but it increases upwards. So actually the proportion of the population around here is starting to get more substantial gains relative to other parts of the population over the last 20 years or the 2000s if you look at just that period. And to give you some sense of context, we've got Brazil, China, Nigeria and Indonesia. Brazil has this kind of curve where it's very much the middle that benefited in Brazil from the last 20 years. Kind of lower middle, maybe because the kind of upper middle's here and the rich here. So in Brazil you had a lot of social policy and social insurance, social protection type programs. They seem to have particularly benefited that sort of lower middle. Nigeria has this rather kind of crazy curve, actually, in a sense, that in Nigeria the bottom 80% of the population are worse off than they were 20 years ago, and what you've got is a real kind of concentration at the top end. All of this assumes that you accept the data that each country generates. There's obviously sort of caveats with expenditure data from any country. China has a sort of same kind of broad base and then rise in some ways as Indonesia, and then India has a similar sort of pattern. So in Indonesia you could say that the growth has been broad based at the lower end, and the middle has gained somewhat, and then the higher end significantly. And then turn to Indonesia's density curve. So you've got the population at the top half, consumption at the bottom half. You've got different years here. Perhaps just focus on the 2011 data. We haven't updated this yet for the SUSNAS from 2012 and 2013, just in the process. What you can see is over the last, from 1980 to 1990 onwards, kind of shifting of the curve. There's a substantial growth in this kind of $2 to $10 range in PPP terms of daily expenditures, but also a quite noticeable sort of increased consumption, particularly focused in that group as well. So not only have the people been expanding in this kind of in-between group, if you take that side as poverty by one of the international poverty lines, and this side is more kind of secure, you've got a kind of burgeoning group there, and quite a substantial bit of consumption there, although obviously a very large increase in consumption there in the upper middle and the top. One of the issues is, how has the share of GNI changed over the last 20 years or longer? I mean, again, there's a stylised fact that Gabriel Palmer identified about the middle capture of 50% of GNI. I think it's a very interesting thesis. In the sense, what he argued is across virtually all countries, developing countries, and virtually over time and types of country, it seems to be that what he defined as the middle, which is you take out the poorest 40% and the richest 10%, tend to capture 50% of GNI, and so ultimately economic development and the political economy of development is really a question of the kind of push and pull between the richest 10% and the poorest 40% in terms of capture of the distribution of income, or in Indonesia, distribution of expenditure. And you can see that that middle is more or less holds as Palmer hypothesized across a number of countries. So what about the literature in this area? There's a burgeoning group of literature. Some of you may have seen some of it. It's particularly growing fast in Latin America, perhaps given because those countries are sort of slightly higher income per capita. I think there's a number of problems with the conceptualization and the measurement. And then Indonesia, using the demographic and health survey, we look at a more asset-based approach to identify, you know, to what extent is there a new group in Indonesia over the last 20 years, and I'll tell you what we find. I mean, first of all, there's the concept of a middle class has been somewhat elusive in a sense. Where he refers to, politicians call it the middle class, pundits refer to it, sociologists study it. What most people think they belong to it, but we don't really know what it is. So actually there's relatively little consensus on the conceptualization of a middle class, and somewhat limited systematic data analysis across the country, partly because of these differences. And one of the issues is whether, like poverty measurement, there's an important aspect of context sensitivity. Of course, there's a long history of class analysis in sociology and classical political economy. More recent sociologists have paid a considerable amount of attention to security, and I talked about the Lopez-Calvo study, about a middle class who doesn't own the means of production but controls skills, knowledge, authorities as their source of power. In terms of the recent economic literature, there's this kind of burgeoning literature that has sought to define middle class, particularly by its place in the distribution or its daily expenditures. Some of it's taken as sort of a global standard. Ravalian talked about $2 to $13. Some of it's taken a more global standard of $10 to $100, and then there are relative definitions about where people sit in the distribution. All of this is useful, but I think one of the problems with the literature is the definition using these kind of expenditure measures. It makes it difficult to think more broadly about what it means in terms of the new burgeoning group. So, of course, Indonesia's own middle class has been the subject of study. Some of you may be familiar with the Asian Development Bank's 2010 report about the rapid growth spending power, market for consumer goods. But at the same time, Indonesia's this burgeoning group is only just above the poverty line in any meaningful sense, so quite vulnerable as well. Maybe more interested in aspects of social policy and social protection and the kind of things that will ensure the vulnerability is reduced. So what about our approach? I'll just run through the approach and then talk through some of the data that's been generated so far and where we're going next with it. So we focused on the idea of mobility assets, in the sense that when we were thinking this through, we were struck by thinking about different groups of people and then looking at how assets had evolved over the last almost 20 years. And we used in this stage the demographic and health survey because it has assets on the transport. And so we separated into three groups: a group who own at least one car, and quite often they own scooters as well. A scooter class, which means people who just own scooters, and the walking poor who don't need neither a scooter nor a car. And the overall pattern comes up something like this. And so bear in mind you've got these international poverty lines that serve some use. I don't think they're by no means perfect. $1.25, $2, and $10 a day. According to the SUSNAS, there's the PPP term is only 5% in Indonesia, but that may be because of whether the SUSNAS captures the top incomes well. And so what we see is this kind of burgeoning group of people in the kind of scooter bit. Sort of very much a decline in those who have no motorised transport. Car ownership is grown incredibly slowly, and all of this speaks to the kind of the density curve I was talking about earlier, in the sense that there's a large number of people who move somewhat into the middle, but people don't jump sort of up to secure higher expenditure lifestyles. It's a very sort of gradual process. So we thought this was kind of interesting, and we explored it a bit further. And what we noticed is, first of all, we found started dividing other assets by the different groups. So we've got a walking for the scooter group and car-only ownership. And interestingly enough, we found that there's a particular strength of in relation to education, in the sense that car ownership is particularly linked to higher education. You see the block there, whereas scooter class is much more about secondary education completion, and then walking is a bit more heterogeneous. And then we also looked at the urban-rural pattern, the sort of a growing urbanisation of the scooter group up to maybe 60, just on the lower 60%. And then we also looked at assets of the housing fabric. And with that, we've seen an even stronger pattern of as you move up from walking scooter car to bricked households. And I think, I mean, when we looked at the Indonesian Family Life Survey, the most robust determinants of being poor or not being poor came out as education level, of housing fabric or housing content. And so we think that there's certainly it's reasonable to make a case that this new and emerging group around these kind of dimensions and assets could be thought of as a non-poor group, but not yet a sort of a fully sort of secure class or secure group. I'm not sure class is actually the right word in some ways. And then we hove down a little bit so that we talked about a restricted scooter. So these are what bit of that is owns at least a scooter but not a car, has secondary education completed, and also has a brick wall, and that brings us down to about a third. Okay, obviously, you know, we can see there's a sort of urban rural, and we also looked at refrigerators and non-refrigerators, kind of asset patterns. And so when you take an overall view of who we're talking about here, you can see a drastic expansion in an asset and the creation of an asset-owning group that I'll come to. I mean, if you obviously we've got the population data to fit the DHS years, and so you know kind of the broad scooter class, obviously potentially 145 million people, but when you start narrowing it down with secondary education, scooter with brick wall, you get down to about 70 million. But what's interesting is this sort of drastic expansion from 10 million to 70 million over a relatively short period of time. So the kind of creation of a lower middle class of some kind. And obviously that suggests a relatively new group of people leading different kinds of lifestyles. And so the question follows, well, what are the kind of social, political implications of that? And actually we're talking about effectively identifying a group that was about 6% of the population, grew to about 12-13% of the population, and is now effectively about a third of the population in this asset-owning group. And it may well be that these people are only slightly above any kind of sort of poverty line in terms of vulnerability to economic shocks or job loss, ill health costs, those kind of things. So I mean that's where we're going next. We're sort of testing this vulnerability question. It relates in part to something we did with the Indonesian Family Life Survey. Is across a range of poverty lines, we tested we wanted to know the 10% and 90% probability of remaining poor. And interestingly enough, you're talking about somewhat similar types of poverty lines to those that Lucas Calvo used in Brazil, Mexico and Chile. In the sense that even if you're on an expenditure of $8 to $10 a day PPP, you can still be vulnerable to falling back under $4 or $5 a day poverty, as is used in higher poverty lines in Latin America. So, in summary, in terms of the size and the characteristics, have I got about 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm almost there actually. So as I mentioned, if you take the kind of the scooter class, the scooter no car, you see this substantial expansion in a group of people with these household assets. And actually that amounts, if you put together the combined group of scooter, secondary education, brick wall, to about a third of the Indonesian population in 2012, accepting some of the caveats with demographic and health survey data. Whichever way you look at it, a substantial increase in a group of people who didn't have those assets 10 or 20 years ago. So the question is, does this matter more than people living different kinds of lifestyles? And that's where we're going next with this project, to look at some of the implications of where we've got to so far. In terms of the definitions and if it's a traditional middle class, first of all, I think we think that using vehicles as an indicator of capturing lifestyles is interesting in the sense you can definitely see what's changed, and the demographic health survey is quite good at sort of providing that data. So you can see there's a new household asset-owning group emerging. The thing is to think about those, particularly those assets. The vehicles are expensive enough not to be universally available, so TVs, mobile phones and so forth are very widespread, but inexpensive enough to show changing patterns over short times. However, the role of vehicles is of course context sensitive, there's the density of settlements, state of the roads, availability of public transport and so forth, which shapes and frames these factors. And where this has led us to now is to think more about assets as a social stratification tool, and to see where we could do what we could do with that in terms of the Indonesian Family Life Survey. Whether this group is a traditional middle class, I think, is a more open question. It's not quite in the kind of car-owning secure class. And in fact, if you look at Nancy Birdsall's work on Latin America, it seems to be much more similar to what she calls as the strugglers. Yeah, so this is a vulnerable group of people well above the international poverty line, so they're not poor. On the other hand, they're not secure from poverty either. They're quite vulnerable to economic shocks. And dilutionality to car ownership, we think that car ownership is too limited. And then finally, in terms of political implications, of course, the Asian Development Bank talked quite a lot about the middle class growth and services accountability. There's a set of econometric studies linking larger groups of non-poor, non-polar groups with governance, better governance, more progressive social policy, social spending. But of course there's definitional issues in that literature as well. Nevertheless, it seems that there's an interesting looking at associations between expansions of non-poor groups and their social and political consequences. So in terms of Indonesia, where we're going next in this project, we're having a look at, trying to look further into as people are contributing more taxes to the state, how that changes their perceptions, issues around insecurity and demand for social protection policies, and all of this, of course, speaks to, if the focus is around scooter ownership, issues around fuel subsidies and social protection, obviously heated topics in Indonesia. So in conclusion, there's clearly a new group of people in the world that didn't exist 20 years ago. It's some kind of new middle. Whether it's a new middle class, I think, is an open question in terms of how you define class. Class is a social identity rather than, but it is based and derived from assets. It's very much a middle income phenomena. And of course, the downside for some middle income countries could be political instability from large groups of frustrated people. It may be indicative of changing purchasing power. Indonesia's expansion looks much more like the lower middle group rather than the upper middle group. So we think the next thing is we're going to look at a kind of look more at this potential for multi-dimensional asset as a class analysis. And underlying that is to then start to look at the political implications, obviously the influence on state finances, on aspiration for security, and the perceptions about the relationship between the governed and the governors. Thank you.
some questions later on. We listen. Susan, please. Susan is right now is Department of Econometrics and Business Statistics at Monash University. Susan got a PhD from University of California, Davis in 2010. Please. Value added from space, from outer space.
Right. So thank you so much for coming, and then thanks to LPEM for having me here. So this is a joint project with John Gibson from New Zealand. So in this project that we are interested to look at to what extent that whether that data they observe from the space can actually add any value to the conventional economic data that we as a researcher have access to, right? So in this presentation, I'm going to present to you some insight what we learned using the evidence from Indonesia, and then I'm going to come back in a few seconds while we chose to work in Indonesia. And then this is still a work in progress, so we would appreciate any comments that you have on this project here. Okay? So let me, before I take you onto the space, let me just set on the ground and let's try to give you some motivation about we start with this project here. So pretty much economic data, such for example gross domestic product, pretty much has been widely used in a cross-country comparison where we try to look at how countries perform with gross domestic product. But the problem with this economic data, this is measured only for many developing countries, right? So if you try to look at the country that's prone to crisis, such as Sub-Saharan Africa, this data is not accurate, or sometimes these data do not exist at all. So as a result, that this poor data quality might hinder some kind of attempt to understanding the economic growth, economic development process, poverty, inequality, and any socio-economic dimensions, right? And then to make the problem even more severe, and I talked to quite a few people that they work on decentralization. When you work on this decentralization, you need to work with the data that beyond the provincial level. You need to work with the regional data. But the problem with this in here, a lot of economic indicators, they are not measured in many countries, not only in developing countries, but that is true the case for developing countries as well, right? So as a result, you might want to try to ask me, why do we care about using this data at the sub-national level? Because for almost a decade ago, there has been a great interest in the causes and the consequences of economic growth at the sub-national level, right? So to take, for example, no matter whether you go to the rich country or a poor country, go to the US or go to the UK or go to Indonesia, you will always find that pockets of wealth, pockets of poverty, right? So as a result, if you want to try to take this variation, we know that there's a variation across country, there's also variation within country. If you want to try to look at this variation within country, you can only detect if you use that data at the sub-national level, right? Because if you use the two aggregator, this has been a mass in here. So I'm going to show you quite a few maps in here. So this is a poverty map for Indonesia that looks at this FGT, what is the proportion of people living the poverty in here. So this is at the district level. So we know that Indonesia, what Andy been talking about, seems to be making quite a good progress in helping the poor people out from poverty. I think according to the latest World Bank report, got only about 14% of people out of poverty, right? But when I try to look at, there is quite a lot of variation across country, right? So some of this poverty, based on this scaling here, so some of this poverty within some province, some district, there's still some people live in poverty about 30% to 60%. That's quite huge, right? So if you want to try to peel another further down layer, so this gives you some kind of picture around at the sub-district level. Still, there is a variation within country, variation within province, within kabupaten, within kecamatan, and so on, right? So as a result, right, you might want to try to look at, so I mentioned to you before that when we have this data, we might know what is the geographical poverty trend, right? When you're talking about this poverty decentralization issue, you need to know, say, a lot of NGO, they try to allocate this fund to poor people, but to do that, we need to know where the poor people are. So that will result in why we need to look at the data at the sub-regional level, right? So now, so for some of you in this room, if you are interested in development economics issue, and then you're also interested in looking at the regional level, but based on what I tell you, that may be something at the end of the day to you, because most of these data for developing countries, they don't exist, or you cannot trust the quality, and then most of the data at the sub-national level, this is not available at all. So what can we do? I mean, let's try to look on the bright side. So what can we do? So you might be able to try to look on the way to improve it, try to use at the light, right? So use this light, observe the light at during night time, or what this will be also here. So the nice thing with this night here is that it's a global coverage on the fine spatial scale. So it can be like by 1 square kilometer, and then you can also detect at the village level here, right? So probably that you might want to ask, what is the relationship between this night light data and then the wealth, right? So probably like think of it here. So as the people get richer, you tend to demand more electricity aspect of here, right? So as people get more richer, they also demand infrastructure that not only create electricity, but also create lights to use television, or you want to blogging, people to work longer, you can drive and so forth, right? So as a result, that all of these taken in this here, the amount that people consume of electricity might be as a good indicator as a way to use that how wealthy people are, right? So as a result, to do this here, so that no matter how chaotic a statistical effort on the ground in here, that we still possible to detect economic activity using alternative source of data, right? So let me try to zoom in on this map here, so this global scale. Can you see clearly from the back? Right, so pretty much in this kind of tell you so the brightly lit the country list, you tend to see a lot of economic activity going on here, right? So for example, in here, so in the US, lots of things happening along mostly the East Coast, and then also some part of Europe, and then Japan, and so forth. Part of Indonesia, we come back to that later on as well. So you can see that at least from what we saw overseas, we also tell from this spatial data. Okay. So let me try to compare use of satellite data on lights at night. So I mean, this satellite data pretty much has been exist in the early 90s, but in the past, that mostly have been used by the geographers, scientists. They try to use this data to understand what is going on with the world in here, right? So the average, I think he's mainly a geographer, so he uses this as a way to proxy for income, but not really doing any economic modeling here. But in the recent years, all economists have tried to do it, and then I just found this recent paper by Pinkowski and Martin. They try to complement this luminosity data using estimating poverty using national account and consumption from households. And then the last three papers here is pretty much more like political economic context. And then it's Mikhailopoulos and Papano, and then Pinkowski. They want to try to do something in Africa, but because these data don't exist, they use this satellite data, luminosity data, as a proxy for this welfare measurement here. And then the paper by Hoffler and Rasky, that is try to look at this regional favoritism. Right, so in this paper that they try to look at, when people give a foreign aid to a country with a weak political institution, they found that all these, the birthplace of this country leader, they tend to be the one with the mostly brightly lit. And then nothing happening in the other region outside the birthplace of this country leader. So let me try to test your geography. So that is a two country. That is show you the comparison between 1992 and then 2008. You see that these countries, we're talking about that there is the red it goes, that means that there is a brighter, the lit is more the bright light here. Anyone can guess which country is it between 92 and 2008? So one country just growing faster and faster, then nothing much happening to other countries. South Korea, North Korea, right? So at least I know that this nightlight can be used as a well-correlated economic change, right? So you can tell what is going on between these two pictures. Right. So now let's try to some of the modeling here. So if you have this nightlight data, we can see at some surface, you can see there's kind of the correlate well with what's going on in the ground here. We can combine socioeconomic data and then luminosity data to get a better estimate of economic activity. So basically this idea here, based on this statistical paper by Browning crossing AR and then around the statistical here, right? So the rationale here, if you really have two faulty measure, but they still measure the same thing, instead of spending the whole money to collect the new data, why don't you just try to combine these two faulty measure and then combine it, and then hopefully that we can reduce the measurement error and then try to get a more precise estimates here. So they pretty much this is what we adopted by Forum Henderson, Storgard and Well, this is a similar paper in 2002 in AR, and then the Churn and Nordahl also pretty much did the same approach as well, right? And then based on their result here, they claim that the luminosity data systematically correlates with economic growth, but they are not quite agree on the conclusion here. So the Henderson et al., they conclude that nightlight measure complement official estimate of income growth, and then Chen and Monash, on the other hand, claim that luminosity data does not add value for country with a good to excellent statistical system. So this only add value to the country with very poor country or poor statistical infrastructure. So that's where what we try to bring to this table is that data on nightlight could really advance research, right? But we don't really know how good of this proxy is. So we don't know whether the Chen Monash is correct or the Henderson is correct. So that's why to see the data from space add value to conventional economic data. So in this case, we examine the relationship between luminosity and the real GDP, and then nicely for Indonesia, because the BPS is so good, and they pretty much collect every single data you can think of. So we are using this as a GDP at the district capital of Indonesia from 2002 to 2010. And then the other thing as well, we also try to validate and use gold standard data on the growth of electrified human settlement in Indonesia for about 4,000 sub-districts to validate nightlight-based measure of economic activity. So this one is we try to look at more at the sub-national level. We also try to validate with what we have observed on the ground through the Codex data. Okay, so you might want to try to choose that. Why to choose Indonesia? So probably a part that the reason that I'm Indonesian, I was born and brought Indonesia. If I told that to referee, so they probably wouldn't like it. I need to convince them more. So Indonesia is a middle income country, and then World Bank pretty much ranked Indonesia is in the second highest category by the World Statistics capacity. So Indonesian capacity statistics is quite good, right? So based on what I told you before, these Chen and Monash, they claim that luminosity has very little value added for this kind of country. Right, so this only works for the country with a very big statistical capacity. So we're going to test whether this is core for Indonesia or not. And then the second nice thing in here, Indonesia is data rich, and then we have this triennial village census letting us to ground truth satellite images of nightlight with other measures of electricity use. Right. So probably Indonesia is the only developing country that I know that have this village level census. No other developing country, and I don't even think that there's any developed country that have that kind of such detailed level of information in here. And then quite nice in here, we kind of become these life experiments, and then some of you in this room might old enough to remember that Indonesia has this financial crisis in the late 90s, that is also called Indonesia economy after early rapid growth. So you might be able to try to test that whether that is we can see that from the data or not. And then there's also about the debate about the severity of this shock and subsequent rate of rebound economic activity. Right, so in this paper that we just recently published in the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies, we try to look at what is the trend of the improvement of a real long-term living standards over the time. So pretty much we are using the angle curve approach. We found that pretty much over from 1983 to 2007, from IFS 1 to IFS 3, we found that this rate of improvement pretty much a bit underreported by what officials suggested. And then that is during the Asian financial crisis, they tend to be also underreported. The extent was severe than being experienced by Indonesian household. Right, so there's got a few things going on here. So we're not really sure. So come back to the data, quite a few sources of data we are using here. So the first source of data is used on the US Air Force satellite data. So this is available free. That is annual measure from National Ocean Atmospheric Administration. That's from 1992 to 2012. So we actually utilize it up to 2010. So they have this satellite observe every location on planet between 8:30 to 10 p.m. local time, right? And then this data has been filtered as free from a cloud cover forest fire or activity. So what do we get from this data? So from this data, once you know how to process this data, we are going to get this light intensity as a measure from 0, that is the unlit area, to 63 is the brightest. So for every 30 second output pixels, about 1 by 1 square kilometer. So this data has been averaged for over 30 events of the year satellites. And then what we did in here, when we processed that, we're going to click this to the spatial file for Indonesia. And then based on this, we're going to create a mean light intensity for Indonesia using the journal mean function based on this radius boundary. I'm going to show you some video clips in here. So, be just like, there will be a big wave that start from 1992. So pretty much, yeah. Yeah, next slide for the difference, right? So as you can see from this, right, so that back in 1992, there's still like nothing much happening. A lot of Indonesia has been unlit, but as that light over the time, that the Java, like, getting brighter and brighter, and then some part of Sumatra, some part of Kalimantan, but there are quite a few parts of Indonesia, especially in the eastern part of Indonesia, that is not much things happening at all. So that's what we observe. Actually, I think that's quite consistent with what people have been done on this original poverty analysis. Right, so this pretty much a lot of satellites, some of the year they have the two different satellites going on here, and then pretty much you can tell these data is available for free, and then we have lots of like pixel global spatial scale in here. It's actually like much cheaper compared to like conduct your own data here. So this is just give you like some kind of more like picture here. So this show you the cumulative distribution function over the time from 1992 to 2010. You like tend to see that it's kind of like shift in this cumulative distribution function, which is consistent that there seems to be that growth in the luminosity of data in Indonesia over the time. But just like still picture of what we saw before, it's about like in 1992, about like total Indonesia is unlit. By the time in 2008, this number has been reduced by quite substantially. And I'm just going to like show you some picture. So that's about, so majority of Indonesia kind of like sit between this digital light between like 3 to like 6 around region. Yeah. But over time, like say consider what we saw on the map. Okay. So like say 1992, about 67% is unlit. By 2009, this number has been dropped to like 40%. That is the same. It is quite a bit substantial increase. Also with a bit brighter area from 1% to about like 2.5% over time. But the still majority sit between like somewhere between middle and then the top of the range. And then this is just to give you let's try to see whether that the light dim during that whether we have experienced shock. So this is try to look at this comparison between 1997 and 1998, right? So this number here telling that there is a change in this digital number is like less than -5, and then the green is that mean that there is a more bright here. So we can see that most of Indonesia, most of the time, we tend to see that it's like being dimming during this financial crisis. But also like some part of Indonesia, there seems to be expansion of the light, partly because that probably like people like lost the job in the urban sector, but they did like go back to the rural area and engage in agricultural sector. That might explain this green part here. But you can see for the Java here, where all the manufacturing service sector here, that seems to want to be can be detected from this data. Okay. So the second data that we are using in here, this is the census of villages in Indonesia. It's a PODES. So this PODES has been collected every 3 to 4 years since 1976. You have data information on the village population, local governance, finance, economy, infrastructure. So we pretty much use these PODES to browse those set of images of night light with other measure of electricity use. So let me just show you briefly, show you some descriptive statistics. So this from different years that we have access to. Probably like what we are interested in, trying to look at number of electricity subscriber. So this over the time, the number that seems to be increasing as well. Some drinking water sources like high water might noting that the village is more wealthy compared to those have access drinking water to river wealth. That it seems again that's kind of a bit like quite increasing pattern. And then this cooking fuel used by the majority population kind of being seems like indicated some kind of development in the village area. So let's try to look at the cross-correlation results. So this is pretty much just from PODES. So we just try to do simple correlation between the luminosity data from 08, 06, 2003, 2019, 93. So probably the one we try to look at, and that seems to be quite highly correlated with what we observe from the ground through PODES and then what we observe from the satellite. That is correlation at the provincial level. So let's try to peel down further, the next level. The district level, so we also try to look at the correlation is still quite strong, so about almost like 80% of most of the time. And then we try to peel down again at the kecamatan level, also like still relatively quite strong here. So at least what we observe on the ground is quite correlated well what we observe from the space. At least that is a good sign, right? So, okay. Now come to the econometrics part here. So I'm not going to go through detail here. So pretty much in this paper, we just following Henderson and our work. We assume that the GDP growth is measured with error of the form of this is the true GDP. This is a measured GDP plus some kind of error term, right? And then we allow this variance and covariance here. And then we know that nothing can be measured accurately. So that's why we also allow error term for this luminosity data. We also allow this measurement error. That's why you have this squiggly sign here. Okay. And then I told you before that we under the assumption that as income rises, so does light usage per person. Thus, relationship between the growth of light and economic growth can be expressed as this is the light, and then this is your income. So that is what's your relationship in here. But the main key assumption, we assume that the covariance error term in the GDP equation and then the luminosity equation, they are not correlated. So that still can't be plausible, right? Because what you observe from the satellite has nothing to do with what observed from the ground, because what we recorded by the satellite is being recorded impersonally, right? The satellite is doing the job. So with whatever we observe on the ground, it's just like doing the GPS stuff and so on, right? So at least that this nature of measurement error is quite different from each other. So that is the main key assumption. And then, regardless of whether you're working with the GDP for a developed country or developing country, we assume that it's poorly measured. We need to make error correction for this beta. And then I'm going to go through this. Once you do all the math in here, this correct calculation can be a function of this sigma from the GDP and the error equation in here. So what I need to make sure in here, so what we're interested in here, we are not going to try to find correlation, causation in here. We just basically purely for predictive purpose. We just want to know right now, using this growth map, what is predict income growth in here. So that's why to get proxy for income growth in here, so you need to inverse of this equation to get as a proxy based on relationship between the night light and then your predicted income growth in here. So the next step in here, we are using the data, the gross produced domestic product collected by the BPS. These both at profit and district level. In this case, we are using the one at Kabupaten level for the 2002 to 2010. So let me try to show you some results here. So the first column here is telling you that is the Y is the log GDP, and then this is your all the X variable here. So the first column we just simply regress the luminosity on that GDP data here. So we found that this 0.486 here is just the elasticity of the measured GDP with respect to luminosity growth. So in this case, quite strong, because when you increase your luminosity by 1%, you are going to increase your GDP growth by about 0.5%. Right. So the second column is just pretty much just a test of the functional form. We also include the square, but looks like this support that is a linear function is enough. Right. Back to the third and fourth column, pretty much we just do the IP instrument here, because that, as I told you mentioned before, in some year they have two satellites going on at the same time. So we just want to be quite careful. So we use the other satellite reading as an instrument for the other readings here. So when you try to do that, that seems to be consistent. There's nothing much change about 0.5 and 0.5 as well. So the next few columns here, we just add a few more things. So the column 5 in here, we just add controlling for extreme outlier, for dummy for unlit area, and then dummy for the top of the area here, still quite robust. And then for the number 6 column here, we just restrict to the sample data that where we have data on on household electricity access in here. Again, that nothing much change, quite robust. And then the last column in here, we just also including this positive change in the light and then negative sign. This means I want to try to test, that want to make sure if there is any change in the regional output, it's going to be captured by the light here. So we saw that change the light, both the positive and negative, they are quite more symmetric. So this is that's what being observed in the change in the GDP. They also like quite picked up by this change in the light area. So now come to the part that combining like two noisy measures to the one good one here. So in this case, again, pretty much a Henderson framework in here. So this is pretty much that this is what we use as a way to estimate from using a night light, and then this is what is the measured GDP what we observe from here. So as a way, we need to find what is the weight to what is a lambda such that we can add some value to the data we use from the space here. So one thing we need to do here is that we need to optimize minimum weight by minimizing this variance at y hat minus y. So of course that you want this space to add value only if this lambda is not equal to 0. Right, so now we can go through this area here. The problem is here like we have you need to have 4 different unknown, but you have 3 different equations here. You cannot solve it, so we need to make some assumption. So the fourth assumption here, we need to make assumption about the signal to the total variance. Right, so once we make this sign here, we can try to back up what is the value for this sigma and so forth here. Okay, a few moments here. So in this case, and then they also in their paper, what is do they allow the variance covering to be the same, but they allow the measurement error to be varies by country. And then also assume value for ratio to total variance for the good data country that sigma good data. Then once you assume this one, you can also imply what's the rest of parameters including the sigma or sigma ratio to bad country and then the sigma and so forth. So this is just a more like graphical intuition here. So this green line is means the data for the good country, good statistical infrastructure. So this bad red is a bad country with the bad statistical infrastructure here, and then this on the x-axis in here is your reliability ratio, right? And then so this here is what is the way that you should be put on the reported growth rate here. So as you can see for this good data, so by construction here, we assuming that country with a good statistical capacity, we can put more trust on their GDP, reported GDP. So that's what if reliability ratio is equal to 1. We are going to put all the sigma on what being reported on the ground, right? So as this sign here is going to decrease, that we are going to put less weight on what being reported on the growth rate here. So even though based on this Henderson work here, you look at this good country, at least they said that at least when you deal with a good country, at least you still use about 50% using the data from what being reported by official statistics, and about 50% from what we use from the space here. Okay. So we try to do this for Indonesia. We also allow income noise to vary within Indonesia. So the way how we do it is just we report data for Java as a good, and then the off Java as a bad. Right. Partly because we think, but just someone tell me if this is totally the crazy idea or not. Because we thought that Java is a home to 60% Indonesian population. A lot of economic activity concentrate on Java, and then Java is also densely populated, and then that's why we thought it's much easier for government infrastructure is much better in Java compared to the other island in Indonesia, and as a result that the data collection must be much more reliable on Java. Right, so what we found in here, that even in conventional data for Java has a strong signal, the optimal way to put continuous economic growth rate data of Java is just about 70%. So with the reliability ratio about 75, the optimal combination would put equal weight or luminosity direct proxy and on conventionally reported on growth rate. So I just show you some data here. So this is here. So if everything is good, it's going to basically you can just trust everything on the GDP measured data, and then off Java here. And as reliability ratios are getting lower and lower, we see about 50% even for Java. We still think that is some added value using the data on the surface space. Yeah. Okay. So let me just conclude it here. So on the bright side, so our results suggest that ground truth and direct estimate of electricity appears to be promising as a proxy for economic activity at a sub-national level, right? So we use that this light growth is reasonable predictor for income growth even at the sub-national level for Indonesia. So So this is quite contrary to what like China and others find. They say, country with a good study system, you don't really have to use this data at all because they don't add any value. So we found that opposite finding. And then policy implications for our finding here. I mean, we do not claim that BPS do not need to collect data. We want them to still collect data because they are doing a great job. But we are not going to expect NALA measure to replace official estimate of income, but we rather to complement this data to get improved estimate of the true income growth here. Right. Once you get this, you can also try to use at the sub-regional level to evaluate what is the patterns of income change, especially they might be relevant for those, try to locate where the poor people are in terms of decentralization, where you want to put your money and so forth, right? And then, because Indonesia is the only country that we're aware of that we can test this, so if this works for Indonesia, that might be the good news for developing country with a weak study system facing difficulty in consistently measuring long-term economic change. Because this satellite data available from 1992 to 2012, right? So as a result, if you want to do growth analysis in here, it's no longer need to be tied to evaluate the high quality data. So the only thing that sky is the limit now, so we can do more by using the alternative measure. That's pretty much I got to say.
Thank you. Interesting. Two speakers